Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and as good as the RTX 5090 is, it's safe to say not everyone has $2,000 to drop on a new GPU. Now, the RTX 5080 is still very expensive, hitting the market at £979 or $999 US, but it is that bit more affordable than the 50 series flagship. Today then, we're going to be putting this new GPU through its paces, looking at raw performance, ray tracing, DLSS 4, power efficiency and more, so stay tuned as we deliver our verdict on this new GPU. First things first then, if you did miss the RTX 5090 review, I would highly recommend going back and checking that one out. It kind of just sets the scene for the RTX 50 series as a whole, plus we got our first look at some technologies exclusive to the Blackwell family, such as DLSS 4 frame generation. Now, the RTX 5080 is very much cut from the same cloth using the same Blackwell GPU architecture, but it has been cut down across the board and significantly so in a few key areas. Core count, for instance, is actually just less than half of the 5080, sporting a total of 10,752 shaders, though that is still a slight increase over the 4080 Super. The same goes for Tensor and RT cores, while ROPs have been reduced by just over a third. Fewer cores does mean Nvidia can push clock speed slightly, this time with the rated boost clock of 2617 MHz. The memory, 16 gigs of GDDR7, can also run slightly faster, this time at 30 gigabits per second, and over the 256-bit memory interface we get total bandwidth of 960 gigabytes a second, which is actually a 30% increase over the 4080 Super. Rated power draw is also higher at 360 watts, but stay tuned for our testing as that figure doesn't really tell the whole story. Speaking of testing, today I am using our brand new GPU test system for 2025, and that is powered by MSI. If you want to get the full specs for this system, I will leave a link down in the description, but it's packing in the AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D CPU paired with MSI's MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, plus we've got 64 gigs of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. All testing was also done using MSI's MPG 321 URX QD-OLED 4K 240Hz monitor. As with my RTX 5090 review then, I am trying to keep things fairly neatly compartmentalized, so we're kicking off with a look at raster performance, so no ray tracing, no DLSS, and then we do look at ray tracing separately, with upscaling only enabled in the 2 path trace games that I test. Then we'll also look at DLSS 4 multi-frame generation separately, just to keep everything apples to apples. You'll also notice in the charts that I'm not actually comparing the RTX 5080 to the 4080, rather I'm using the 4080 Super as the direct comparison, and there's two main reasons for this. First of all is that the difference between a 4080 and a 4080 Super is minimal at best, we're talking like 2% on average, so I personally thought it'd be a waste of time to benchmark both of those GPUs, and I would have rather tested something else like the 3080 Ti, which would be a much more useful comparison. And the second reason is the fact that the 4080 Super actually launched at £959, so basically the same price as the 5080, so it will show us exactly what performance gains are on offer at the same price point. Lastly then, before we dive into the benchmarks, it is worth saying I'm focusing on 1440p and 4K data in this video, but of course, if you want to see 1080p, 1440p, 4K, all of our power testing data, head over to the written review on kitguru.net. That's in the description and in a pinned comment down below. Kicking off the benchmarks then with Alan Wake 2, as mentioned in my RTX 5090 review, we're still experiencing frame time issues with the new Blackwell GPUs, something I'd expect to be fixed soon with a driver update. However, looking at the average frame rate, the RTX 5080 delivers 87 FPS at 1440p, putting it 9% ahead of AMD's RX 7900 XTX, while it's 13% faster than the RTX 4080 Super. Stepping up to 4K sees the 5080 now average 49 FPS, giving it 12% and 14% gains over the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super respectively. It's also 15% slower than the RTX 4090 and 35% behind the RTX 5090. Moving on to Black Myth Wukong, at 1440p the RTX 5080 is good for 52 FPS on average, giving it a 12% lead over the 4080 Super. It's also 12% slower than the 4090 and 29% behind the 5090. Increasing the resolution to 4K sees even the mighty RTX 5090 drop below 60 FPS, so upscaling is definitely required to hit higher frame rates. Still, the 5080 is 15% faster than the 4080 Super, and now 14% slower than the 4090. Cyberpunk 2077 is next, and this one is definitely favourable to the RTX 50 series. At 1440p, for instance, the 5080 delivers 131 FPS on average, making it 10% faster than the 7900 XTX, and it's 14% ahead of the 4080 Super. Things do improve as we increase the resolution to 4K, however, and we now see a 23% gain over the 4080 Super, and that's actually the largest single increase we will see from our gaming benchmarks today. It's also just 8% slower than the RTX 4090. Next up is Final Fantasy XVI, another very GPU intensive game, resulting in an average frame rate of just 66 FPS for the 5080 at 1440p. That gives it just a 5% lead over AMD's flagship 7900 XTX, while it's 9% faster than the RTX 4080 Super. At 4K, the 4080 now holds a 12% advantage over its predecessor, the 4080 Super, but again, it's only 7% faster than the RX 7900 XTX. We can also see that it's coming in 33% slower than the RTX 5090. Forza Horizon 5 is another game I love to test as it delivers very high frame rates even at maximum image quality settings, as we can see at 1440p with the 5080 averaging 186 FPS. It is, however, only level with the RX 7900 XTX, a great result for the AMD GPU, but perhaps a disappointing one if you're NVIDIA. Up at 4K, the margins don't really change, with the 7900 XTX and 5080 still neck and neck. Versus the 4080 Super, we're looking at a 12% gain for the new Blackwell GPU. Ghost of Tsushima is another well-optimized title, but one that does scale very well on AMD GPUs. The RX 7900 XTX is again on par with the RTX 5080, despite launching over 2 years ago at a similar price. At 4K as well, that picture really doesn't change. We can see the 5080 coming in just 7% faster than the 4080 Super, a fairly unimpressive gain, it has to be said. Horizon Forbidden West is another title where the RTX 50 series really doesn't impress versus the 40 series. The 5080, for instance, is barely 6% faster than the 4080 Super at 1440p, while it's 16% slower than the 4090. Even at 4K, the gains over the 4080 Super are just 9% on average, and that means the 5080 is 34% slower than the RTX 5090. That disappointing trend continues as we move on to The Last of Us Part 1, another title where the 5080 is just unable to offer any meaningful gains over AMD's RX 7900 XTX. In fact, it's 3% slower at 1440p, and that makes it just 7% faster than the 4080 Super. Thankfully, things do look better at 4K resolution, where the 5080 is able to hit 59 FPS on average, and that works out as a 13% lead over the 4080 Super. It is, however, still just behind the 7900 XTX and comes in 21% slower than the RTX 4090. Now, A Plague Tale Requiem does restore some semblance of expected behaviour, with the 5080 now hitting 114 FPS at 1440p, and that makes it 11% faster than the 4080 Super and 13% slower than the RTX 4090. Up at 4K, it increases its lead over the 4080 Super to 17%, which is a bit more like it, but it's still well behind the RTX 5090, coming in 35% slower. As for Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, the gains over the 4080 Super are much more limited here. We're looking at just a 6% uplift at 1440p, while the 5080 is 8% faster than the 7900 XTX. Even at 4K resolution, we're still only looking at an 8% gain for the 5080 versus its predecessor, though it does stretch its lead to 15% over the RX 7900 XTX. Starfield is another title that doesn't seem to scale particularly well on Blackwell GPUs. We're looking at just a 5% gain for the 5080 over the 4080 Super at 1440p, while it comes in 20% slower than the 4090. At 4K, the 5080 does claw back some performance, now coming in 8% faster than the 4080 Super, with an average frame rate of 64 FPS, though that's still not amazing. It's also, once again, 33% slower than the RTX 5090. We close out our raster benchmarks then with Total War Warhammer 3. While the 5080 is no faster than the 7900 XTX at 1440p, it does deliver an 8% advantage over the RTX 4080 Super. That lead is actually stretched to 14% as we increase the resolution to 4K, though the 5080 is still on par with the 7900 XTX and also comes in 16% behind the RTX 5090. Overall then, across the 12 games tested at 1440p, the RTX 5080 delivered an average frame rate of 110 FPS, and that makes it 9% faster than the RTX 4080 Super. It's also just 7% faster than the 7900 XTX, while it's 15% and 30% slower than the RTX 4090 and RTX 5090 respectively. At 4K, the gains over the 4080 Super do get slightly wider, with the 5080 now 13% faster on average, while it's 8% ahead of the 7900 XTX. It still lags behind the RTX 4090 by 15%, and it's now 34% slower than the RTX 5090. For one final comparison though, and something I've not focused on today up until now, is the matchup against the RTX 3080 Ti, and that launched at £1,049 back in mid-2021. Here we can see the RTX 5080 comes in 51% faster on average at 4K. Just to break down the relative rasterization performance then versus the 4080 Super, at 1440p over the 12 games tested, we saw gains between 5 and 14%. As mentioned, the 5080 can stretch its legs somewhat at 4K, where it proved to be 8 to 23% faster than the 4080 Super, depending on the exact game, though 4 of the 12 titles tested did show less than a 10% difference. Using that average frame rate data just presented, here we're looking at the cost per frame using the UK MSRP launch prices for each GPU. While the overall performance of the RTX 5080 may not be mind-blowing, there is at least the positive point that the 5080 has not increased its price over the 4080 Super, and that does mean a small improvement to cost per frame, 9% to be exact, when using the MSRP data. It's hardly a revolution and still lags behind other GPUs like the RTX 4070 Super and RX 7800 XT, but it is at least a step in the right direction. Calculating cost per frame based on current street pricing is another matter, however, and here we can see the RX 7900 XTX does technically offer better value with a couple of choice deals on at the minute, though it has to be said, general availability of that GPU is drying up fast and I really don't expect it to last much longer. Still, cost per frame does remain improved compared to the 4080 Super, which I wasn't able to find cheaper than £970 here in the UK. Moving on to ray tracing performance then, just as a reminder, only the two path trace games I'm testing, being Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong, have quality level upscaling. All other games are tested at native resolution. Starting with Alan Wake 2 then, even with upscaling enabled, this one is very punishing, and on average at 1440p, the RTX 5080 is good for just 60 FPS, and that makes it 9% faster than the RTX 4080 Super. It is, however, almost 3 times as fast as AMD's RX 7900 XTX, showing the clear gulf in class when it comes to ray tracing performance. Then at 4K, we're looking at 34 FPS on average, working out as an 11% boost over the RTX 4080 Super. As for Black Myth Wukong, this is another punishing title when path tracing is enabled, and at 1440p, the 5080 manages 65 FPS on average, even when using quality level upscaling. That makes it 13% faster than the 4080 Super, but it's 12% slower than the 4090. 4K sees frame rates drop to just 36 FPS on average too, though that does actually work out as an 18% lead over the 4080 Super. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077, where we are not using any kind of upscaling. At 1440p, the 5080 delivers an 8% gain over the 4080, though that makes it 63% faster than the RX 7900 XTX. At 4K resolution, the 1% lows do drop below 30 FPS, so you definitely want to enable DLSS, and then the 5080 comes in 20% slower than the RTX 4090. Next up is F1 24, where the 5080 is able to deliver 103 FPS with ray tracing cranked to the max. That gives it a 16% lead over the 4080 Super at 1440p, though it still can't catch the 4090. At 4K as well, the overall margins haven't really changed. We can still see the 5080 is sitting in third place on our chart, faster than the 4080 Super, but slower than the 4090. Ratchet Clank does show smaller gains for the 5080 over the 4080 Super though, with the Blackwell GPU coming in 10% faster on average at 1440p. It is, however, almost double the performance of AMD's current flagship, while it's 18% slower than the 4090. Up at 4K, we're now looking at a 9% gain over the 4080 Super, so again, pretty disappointing, though the 5080 is 22% slower than the 4090. Returnal is up next, and this one is a relatively light workout when it comes to ray tracing, at least by modern standards, and at 1440p the RTX 5080 delivers 111 FPS, putting it 10% behind the 4090 and 12% ahead of the 4080 Super. At 4K, that lead stretches to 13% over the 4080 Super, but the 4090 has pulled away somewhat, and the 5080 is now 15% slower. As for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, an oldie but definitely a goodie in my opinion, at 1440p the RTX 5080 cranks out 158 FPS with ray tracing maxed out, and that makes it 10% faster than the 4080 Super, while it's 40% ahead of even the 7900 XTX. At 4K it still barely breaks the sweat, hitting 88 FPS without any upscaling, and that's an 11% uplift versus the 4080 Super, though it is still well behind the 4090. Lastly, we finish off with Star Wars Outlaws, a game that shows precious little gain for the 5080 versus the 4080 Super, just 6% at 1440p to be exact, which is barely a 4 FPS difference. At 4K, we're talking just a 2 FPS difference, but at least the 5080 is coming in 26% faster than the RX 7900 XTX. Overall then, averaged over those 8 ray trace games tested, the 5080 comes in 11% faster than the 4080 Super at 1440p. It is miles ahead of AMD's RX 7900 XTX, however, with a 55% advantage there, but it is still 16% slower than the RTX 4090. At 4K though, we see another 12% gain on average over the 4080 Super, so really, scaling is very similar to the raster performance we looked at earlier in the video. The 5080 is now 57% faster than the 7900 XTX, while it's also 74% better than the RTX 3080 Ti, which shows us how far things have come in 2 generations. Interestingly, cost per frame for ray tracing performance looks much more favourable for the RTX 5080, given it sits top of the chart, though only just, as it's delivering 2% better value than the 4070 Super. Compared to the 4080 Super, we're looking at another 9% improvement to cost per frame. Things aren't quite so impressive though when looking at the ray trace cost per frame data using current street pricing, with the 4070 Super retaking the lead, but the RTX 5080 is still in second place, offering marginally better value than the RTX 4070 Ti Super. Let's move on though and talk about DLSS 4, obviously a key selling point for these GPUs, and specifically we're talking about multi-frame generation or MFG. Now I'm not going to go over every single point I made in the RTX 5090 review, so be sure to check that one out if you want some of the visual quality discussion. What I will say though is that multi-frame generation is very much comparable to regular frame generation in terms of its pros and cons. The difference really is just that you get more extra frames with MFG, as it can insert up to 3 extra frames. Looking at Alan Wake 2 then, with all settings cranked to the max, performance is very low when only using DLAA, and using Super Resolution Performance mode alone with no MFG brings us up from 17 FPS to 46 FPS, alongside a substantial decrease to latency. Then using the 2x, 3x and 4x modes for MFG, that will further boost your frame rates, maxing out at 149 FPS, though of course latency does increase slightly with each mode and is higher than if you weren't using MFG at all. The same can also be observed in Cyberpunk 2077. Good luck using path tracing without any form of upscaling, and even with super resolution alone, 54 FPS isn't super smooth, I'd say. MFG does what it's designed to do though, and boosts frame rate significantly, up to 169 FPS when using its 4x mode, though latency does increase by just under 16 milliseconds compared to not using MFG at all, so again, definitely something to bear in mind. Hogwarts Legacy though is that bit easier to run, even with ray tracing maxed out, and as such, we see even higher frame rates when using MFG. We're looking at an average of 142 FPS when only using Super Resolution Performance mode, but enabling MFG 4x whacks that up to 326 FPS. Latency is also lower across the board here, though it is still 40% higher when using MFG 4x compared to when only using Super Resolution Performance. Now, I also retested the RTX 4080 Super in these 3 games, and being an Ada GPU, it is limited to just regular frame generation instead of multi-frame generation, so it can only insert 1 AI generated frame rather than up to 3, as with the RTX 50 series. As such, that means you can get significantly higher frame rates with the 5080, and this is what was behind Nvidia's claims of 2x the performance of the 4080. Obviously though, this is dependent on the game supporting frame gen, and these aren't the raw performance increases we saw earlier in the video, but I guess it is worth pointing out if MFG is a feature that you might value. The next area to cover though is going to be our AI and productivity testing, where we're looking at a couple of benchmarks from UL Procyon, Geekbench, and then render performance in both Blender and V-Ray. Starting with our Stable Diffusion XL FP16 image generation test, here the RTX 5080 delivers just a modest 6% gain over the RTX 4080 Super, while it's 24% slower than the RTX 4090. There are more positives to take from the AI text generation benchmark, however, particularly when looking at performance from the two Llama models. In both cases here, the RTX 5080 delivers gains of over 20% compared to the RTX 4080 Super. Geekbench AI Pro's performance is more mixed, however, with the single precision result even slightly slower than the RX 7900 XTX, but the half precision results are faster than the RTX 4090 and mark a gain of 14% over the RTX 4080 Super. Moving on to Blender performance then, using the 4.3.0 benchmark, and we're specifically looking at the classroom scene, we're once again looking at just a 6% gain over the RTX 4080 Super. V-Ray GPU benchmark performance is more impressive, however, when using the RTX path. Here, the 5080 comes in 23% faster than the 4080 Super, and it's 16% slower than the RTX 4090. Switching gears now though to look at the 5080 Founders Edition. Visually it may look identical to the 5090 model, but there have actually been a few changes under the hood. Instead of using a 3D vapor chamber for instance, Nvidia has instead opted for a more traditional heat pipe and base plate cooler arrangement, and we're also told it's no longer using liquid metal thermal interface material. It is still the same double flow-through design, however, with the tiny PCB slapped right in the middle, allowing air to pass through the heatsink almost unobstructed, but it's not quite the same absolute high-end design as the 5090, though I guess that does make sense as the 5080 draws 200 watts less power. As we can see when looking at thermal performance then, the 5080 Founders Edition cooler is still more than a match for this 360 watt GPU even after those internal changes, and the temperatures hit just below 65 degrees over our 30-minute stress test. VRAM meanwhile was slightly warmer at 76 degrees, but still nothing to worry about. Now it would be interesting to see what performance would have been like if Nvidia had used the same exact cooler for the 5080 as with the 5090, but even with a few cutbacks this is more than good enough. Noise levels are also slightly improved over the 5090 FE2. My 5090 ran the fans at 46% or 1585 RPM, whereas the 5080 is more relaxed at 42% or 1475 RPM fan speeds, and that reduces noise by 2 decibels. I'm also happy to report that I did not notice any coil whine on my RTX 5080, I guess likely due to just less power going through the PCB. As for power and efficiency though, in my opinion, this is where things get very interesting. As a reminder, we use Nvidia's PCAT tool to measure power draw of the graphics card only on a per game and per resolution basis. Here we're looking at the 4K data over all 12 games tested, and I was actually fairly surprised to see that actual power draw is much lower than the rated 360 watt TGP. Now there are a couple of games which see higher power draw, like Cyberpunk 2077 and A Plague Tale Requiem, but actually 8 of the 12 games tested saw power draw below 300 watts. On average, power is just 6 watts higher than the 4080 Super in my testing, and that does bode well for when we look at performance per watt in just a moment. It is worth noting though that power draw does go up when ray tracing is enabled, with 6 of the 8 games tested now drawing over 300 watts, but it's still averaging just 310 watts, which is 50 watts below the rated TGP. It is worth noting, however, that its margin of power draw has gone up to 18 watts versus the 4080 Super, which works out as a 6% increase. The good news is that with only marginally higher power demands, the RTX 5080 does see an improvement to performance per watt, coming in 10% better than the RTX 4080 Super. Now, it's not a massive leap forward by any means, but it does make the 5080 the most efficient GPU we have ever tested. Compared to the 5090, it delivers 12% better performance per watt, and it's actually not far off double the efficiency of the RTX 3080 Ti. Again, it's hardly the jump from Maxwell to Pascal, but at least things haven't gone backwards, unlike with the RTX 5090. Closing out then with just a quick look at total system power draw measured in A Plague Tale Requiem at 4K, we can see that power is very similar to the RTX 4080 Super and is only slightly ahead of AMD's RX 7900 XT. So that brings us to the end of our RTX 5080 review, and being honest with you guys, I imagine plenty of you are sitting there watching this feeling pretty disappointed, perhaps something even stronger. After all, with the RTX 5080 coming in as a direct successor to the RTX 4080 Super, but delivering just a 13% performance gain at 4K, it's not exactly a big step forward. In fact, things are surprisingly close up against AMD's RX 7900 XTX, with the 5080 coming in just 8% faster on average when looking at raster performance. It's also 15% slower than the RTX 4090 and 34% behind the RTX 5090, with very similar scaling on show when looking at ray tracing performance too. In other words, the 80 class of GPUs have never been further behind the NVIDIA flagship. Gone are the days when something like the RTX 3080 was just 15% slower than the RTX 3090 for basically half the cost. That said, things don't look quite so bad if we take just a step back. Comparing against the RTX 3080 Ti, for instance, a GPU which launched for £1,049 back in mid-2021, we can actually see the 5080 come in 51% faster on average for rasterization, and that increases to 71% when looking at the ray tracing performance. That means anyone upgrading from an older 80 class GPU will see a decent improvement, but it's still not a mind-blowing leap forward. After all, the jump from the RTX 2080 to the RTX 3080 was roughly 70% from just a single generation, but that type of gen-on-gen increase really does seem to be a thing of the past. There are more positives though if we look in a couple of other areas. Our AI and productivity benchmarks, for instance, showed a couple of examples where performance actually increased by over 20% compared to the 4080 Super, and efficiency has actually increased. Again, not by much, we're looking at about a 10% improvement to performance per watt at 4K, but that is enough to make the 5080 the most efficient gaming GPU we have ever tested. NVIDIA will also point to its new DLSS 4 technology and specifically multi-frame generation as a key selling point for the RTX 50 series. After first getting hands-on with it during the RTX 5090 review, overall behaviour is exactly as expected when tested with the RTX 5080, and overall, yeah, I do think it is a good feature to have. Though it's not perfect and it crucially doesn't solve the latency problem of the previous frame gen implementation. I would certainly rather have it than not, but I don't think it's reason alone to upgrade to a Blackwell GPU. Overall then, I think it's fair to say that the RTX 5080 is hardly going to set the world alight. It's not terrible considering the fact that it does launch at the same price as the 4080 Super, but does offer at least some performance improvement, but it's only a very small step forward. I think the sad reality is that NVIDIA simply has no incentive to push things forward in this market segment, as they just have no real competition. Sure, the RX 7900 XTX is there or thereabouts when it comes to raster performance, but the reality is it gets mullered in basically every other department. I'm talking things like ray tracing, efficiency, AI and productivity workloads, while I still don't think FSR is on the same level as DLSS, especially not with the recent transformer updates to both ray reconstruction and super resolution. If then the RTX 5090 is more like a 4090 Ti, which some people have been calling it, then it's definitely fair to say the RTX 5080 is more like a 4080 Ti Super. But if you want the fastest graphics card that isn't the 5090, it's really your only choice. And that is where I'm going to leave this video, guys. So if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description. And while there, you'll also find a link to our merch store where you can pick up a cool t-shirt like one of these on screen. Finally, if you're feeling particularly generous, you can also help us out by backing us on Patreon. But that's where I'm going to leave this one, guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.